Now, whichever way you go about it, whatever kind of thing you deal with, you can talk about it in other ways. You can talk about going from what happens into the happening of what happens. That's very important, the happening. What will always happen in the end, whichever way you go about it, you'll end up with appearing. You can start where you like. You'll always end up with appearing, in which you find that you go from what appears back upstream into the appearing of what appears. Now this, when we get to that, although I put this here so it looks like it's just the same as saying distinguishing, which it is, seeing. Nevertheless, all of these turn out to be instances of appearing. And this is what turns out to be fundamental. And this will take us into the very core of what phenomenology really is. But we have to get to that. I'm not going to start there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to deal with distinguishing. And then when I've done that, I shall come back to a certain point in what I've done in distinguishing and show you how this leads into appearing and how that's the really fundamental thing. That's where I'm going next. I don't know if anyone at this point, before I start that, wants to say anything or ask anything or what. All been done.
Henry, I was last Friday. I was cycling to Totnes and I managed to bump into Philip, who was sat by the river. And so we had a discussion about what the course and what we've been trying to do. And I noted that Philip and Patricia, I don't know whether you've all noticed this, they have a very distinct way of speaking that allows things to happen. And I think that's the language that you were talking about. But in practice, and I don't know whether you can say anything about. So it takes practice to be able to speak in that particular way, is that right?
It's a way of speaking in which enables something to become present. It comes to presence. This is Gardner talks about this a lot. So there's calls it phenomenological speaking. There's a way of speaking in which what you're talking about actually becomes present. Not present, comes to presence in the speaking. And so it's very concrete. And it's done by, you have to focus on what you do. So if I'm doing this kind of thing I'm talking about here, I have to be trying to do that as I'm talking. Or if I'm reading something. If I'm reading something, I actually have to go through it in my mind as I'm reading it. If I just read it, it won't work. I actually have to think it. And if I'm working with perception, I actually have to see what it is I'm saying. Well, sometimes you can't. But what it turns out, interestingly, it also works if you're trying to do it. It's not succeeding, apparently, but sometimes I've given talks in which I haven't been able to do it at all. And I thought, well, that was dreadful. but other people have found it was there, and it's because I've been trying to do it. And that seems to be it. So, I mean, Gardner does talk about it. You speak in such a way that what you're speaking about comes to presence. And he talks about it in various language, which I certainly recognised. And it's a concrete way of working. And of course, I suppose you'd say, well, it's not. It's quite different from the usual intellectual way of working. So you find that?
Well, the way I find it is, it just, I was trying to describe it to Philip, it seems that there's a lot of room in the words, and it's a bit like being able to enter into the meaning,
yes,
that way,
right.
rather than it being imposed.
Yes.
And that's the way
very much so, entering into the meaning. And actually this is connected with what I was just saying about appearing. I'll be saying more about that later. It enables things to appear. And they appear through the words, the meaning. And again, people are not familiar with this. I mean, I know many people, I've done things with them, and they say, do you know, I don't understand how you've done that, because you were just using language. And I mean, language is such a dreadful thing. It cuts us off from the world completely. And yet, you just did nothing else but use language. You didn't do any exercises, no meditation, nothing like that. And yet, from your saying that, I've got this sense of wholeness and I can't get rid of it. And so, as well, yeah, it's because your assumption about what language is completely up the creek, my friend. Not you.
Yeah,
only, that's what the answer to that is. But then if you say anything, they say, oh, surely not, and so on. That people, language, that's one of the great discoveries that has been made, which again is ignored. Language can do a great deal more than we think it can. It can be much more living, and it can become phenomenological. Things can come to appearance in it. Of course, it can be the opposite. You only have to listen to politicians talking every day. I know this is a cliche. My wife listens to the news endlessly on radio and television and so on, so I hear a lot of this stuff. And I mean, we both agree, you hear them talking, and they're just using words, and those words don't have any meaning, because they're using those words to say the opposite of whatever it is. I mean, you know this so well. You just listen to them being interviewed, and the words come out, and they don't have meaning. In that sense in which you've just talked about. And they will never know about this. I mean, imagine telling Tony Blair about this. Yeah, imagine. That's how it works. It's a question of things appearing, coming to appearance. When it comes to appearance, it doesn't sort of flash up like a picture, like it becomes present. Oh, yes, that's better. I forgot to mention something, which I can do now, rather than this distinguishing is a bit of a long haul. It actually requires careful concentration, and I have to go very slowly. And it occurred to me. I was going to start it now, but probably a bit tired now. I forgot to mention this paper. I can at least do that rather than this thing. You read this last week, didn't you? This thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that. This paper started life at this very time I'm talking about. This version was published in 1986, but this is not the original. In the original version, there was no mention of Goethe at all, because I hadn't come across Goethe. I knew who Goethe was, but I hadn't done anything about Goethe at all. So, after encountering the whole of the active absence, when we come to this Goethe thing, Goethe's way of science, that's not in the original. What happened was, on the course I've just mentioned to you, there was a man called David Seaman, who does a lot in American professor in architecture and so on and that. And he was very taken with this course. And in fact, it affected him. He went into phenomenology, and he told me years later it was because of this course that I did. So at least there was one person who got something out of it. And he wanted to republish a paper I'd done on the whole, and I didn't want to republish it. And by then I'd done the Goethe, and he said, well, you could change it and put a section in on Goethe, because there was a lot of later stuff in the paper was on Heidegger, without mentioning Heidegger explicitly. And I didn't want to do that then. And it went quite far. I didn't want to. I thought at the time I was trying to go too far. So then a new version was written in which the first part was changed slightly but kept more or less the same, and the whole section on Goethe put in, because Goethe illustrated very clearly, it seemed to me, what I'd said about wholeness, and that fact that it fits like hand and glove. I was really quite surprised how well it went. But the original paper was given as a talk at a conference called, I forgot what it's called now. It was a Jubilee conference, 25th anniversary conference of the Institute for the Comparative Study of History, Philosophy and the Sciences, which is an organisation set up with this man, J.G. Bennett, I was talking about, and he set it up in 1946. And he asked me to give a talk because someone had fallen out at the last minute. Or not quite the last minute, no. And I happened to be in the room when a telephone call came through. And he said, oh, that's a nuisance. It means that I have to give 2 talks. He thought that was bad. And then I was in the room. And he said to me, you should give a talk. And I said, I don't know what... No, I can't give a talk. No, I don't know what to talk about. And he went quiet. He used to do this. He went quiet. And then he said, you, in very ex cathedra manner, because he talked like this, he was that kind of person, you should give a talk on the whole, counterfeit and authentic. And that was it. Now, the astonishing thing is, in that moment he encapsulated the battle that was going on in me, of which he was actually suffering from as well, the way I was. And I did do this talk, and I had a terrible job with it. And then that's what formed the first part of this, that talk. That's what I did. And it went down well, and things went from there. And so then this paper was published, or an earlier version of it. So, and what's actually in here is, the subtext in here is I'm all the time getting at the systems approach. What I'm actually saying between the lines is that this is an alternative to systems thinking. Systems thinking, it doesn't understand this thing, that the whole comes to presence within the parts. The whole never actually becomes present. If it became present, it would become an object. And it never does that. The whole comes to presence. So it's a kind of absence, but an active absence. And it presences. Now this language of coming to presence, presencing particularly, I got from Heidegger. I found this in Heidegger. I had a long problem finding some way of trying to talk about what I was experiencing, what it was, what I was trying to get at. And I found that language in Heidegger. It's post-being and time Heidegger. And it's when he went back to the early Greeks. And I found this there, presencing, coming to presence, and so on and that. Not becoming present, because then it would stand forth and come out as an object, and the whole never does that. If it did, it would become like a part. And I wanted to get across this sense that you could not grasp the whole with that kind of calculative thinking that can grasp hold of it. You never could. You're always at the receiving end, and not the controlling end. And I also had this problem with systems theory, that it tended to make the whole very dominant. Instead of, everyone was agreed, we don't want the bottom-up approach, because that just goes from the parts and then tries to make the whole out of the parts. That's reductionism. But the top-down approach, which is holism, is just as bad, because the whole now dominates, and this is what has been recognised by people as the totalising influence of systems thinking, where the whole will be imposed. And I know this because obviously with the management consultants, they imposed this vision, and then you were told what you were, and this sort of business. This is very bad. So I wanted to get away from both of those, and so I tried to get it So there was a kind of reciprocalness between the whole and the parts, that actually the whole depends on the parts in order to be whole. In order to come forth, to come into presence, it can only do this through the parts. But the parts themselves can only be significant as a consequence of the whole that comes to presence through them. Otherwise, they're nothing. So I felt there was this peculiar kind of reciprocal, almost co-determination, reciprocal dependency of the whole on the parts as much of the parts on the whole. And this was dynamic, and it got away from this either bottom-up or top-down approach. And it was dynamic. There was a reciprocal, I used the word a moment ago, which I liked, and it's gone now. Oh, well, dependency, I suppose. That, for me, was very much what I wanted to do. And basically, forget the Goethe bit, it's all there in the first few pages. I mean, I do these examples. It really starts with the hermeneutic circle there, because this is the hermeneutic circle shows here the reciprocal relationship of part and whole, and then not going from the part to the whole or from the whole to the part and so on. The whole and the parts in here, it's all in there. Next 2 pages, we must insist on moving in both directions at once, so that we have neither the resultant whole as a sum nor the transcendental whole as a dominant authority, but the emergent whole which comes forth into its parts. It's a different way of thinking, you see. And then this process tells us something fundamental about the whole in a way which shows us the significance of the parts. If the whole presence is within its parts, then a part is a place for the presencing of the whole, and so on that. And and then encountering the active absence, that's it. That's all you need. There's half a dozen pages. Well, count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There's 8 pages in there, from the hermeneutic circle to the active absence, which says it all. And that has actually been found, astonishingly, by quite a lot of people to be very useful. And I'm glad now that David Seaman persuaded me to redo it. So the Goethe bit then comes on afterwards as an example. But that fitted what he wanted to do. Now, there's an interesting book I mentioned Ingrid Stefanovich, and I only found out a few years ago that she wrote a book. I don't have it with me. Sometimes I carry it with me, but I haven't done this time. She wrote a book, and it's got a title which tells you nothing of what the book's about. I wrote it down. Oh, for heaven's sake, where did I put it? Oh, thank God for that. It's called, of all things, Stefanovich, Stefanovic. I think it's in the library. It better be in the library, because every year I said it should be there. And I don't think... It's called Safeguarding Our Common Future. Rethinking Sustainable Development. Now, I don't think Stefan liked the idea. He wasn't, I don't know. But I think they have got it now. You see, Safeguarding Our Common Future, Rethinking Sustainable Development. Well, it tells you nothing what the book's about. It is about this, but that's irrelevant. It's actually a book which introduces phenomenological thinking in the context of environmental studies and how to do it phenomenologically. And the second part of the book is called Foundations of Phenomenological Thought. And chapters 4, 5 and 6 are bloody brilliant. And she's very much influenced by Heidegger. And she teaches in the University of Toronto, and she teaches this stuff to students. And she actually uses my work in several places, because she picked up this reciprocal whole and part. Because she wants to do wholeness, but doesn't like holism, doesn't like the systems approach. Because many people who are interested are very much against holistic thinking, because the way in which it dominates. And a lot of people think that holistic thinking is bad when it becomes the systems approach with this totalising influence. And I'm one of them. Actually, the subtext of what I'm doing there, saying you can think wholeness without that. And she picked this up, and she mentions that, and one or two other things. But she then gives brilliant examples of her own work with using Heidegger. What she did not know and does not know is that the language I got here, coming to presence, presencing and so on, I actually got from Heidegger. And so that's why it fits what she's doing quite well. And she gives an absolutely marvellous illustration of her own work with photography. When she moved to Vancouver, and I don't know, I haven't got the book with me. I think I quoted part of it in the footnote. Oh, I'll never find it. Notes. Here we are. He said, yeah, oh yeah. Actually, I've written a note on all this. I think I've said all that, so I need to bother about that. But I really wanted, I've got here, this is a part of an extended note to make it clearer, that in fact, the sense that, yep, I've done all that, yep, okay. Now, this is illustrated by this experience, and it's a bit wobbly because it didn't photocopy properly. I am reminded of my first experience in photography when I lived in a particularly beautiful section of Victoria, British Columbia, some years ago. The spectacular houses and gardens of Oak Bay had been part of my everyday world for only a few months when I resolved one weekend to meander through my neighbourhood, capturing images through the lens of my new camera. For the first time, I took notice of details of leaded windows, garden fountains and flowers that were miraculously already blooming in February. I need to go there. This experience led me to realise that while the camera focused my attention on specific aspects of my neighbourhood, what made these images special was that they constituted more than an isolated atomistic passing up of the neighbourhood through the camera lens. Instead, each image was significant inasmuch as it captured and articulated in a distinctive way the sense of place of the neighbourhood as a whole. On the one hand, I was drawn to notice particular details that I had missed when I had sought. On the one hand, I was drawn to notice particular details that I had missed when I had not sought them out through the lens of the camera. On the other hand, each individual photograph was all the more meaningful to the degree that the broader sense of the place as a whole was reflected in and even in some sense enriched in each photographic image. Now there you've got a wonderful picture of the reciprocal nature of the whole and the part. These photographs, a non-photographer would say, oh, well, those are just objective images, they're nothing. But through those images, she begins to see a sense of the place as a whole coming to presence. And when it puts them all together, she sees the way that they belong together, then she gets a strong sense of the wholeness, of the sense of place of that neighbourhood. And that's coming through these images, which we could also look at and say, these are just objective images, no more than that. And what you've done is you've atomized the environment into these atomized pictures, which are just objective fragments, as it were. You've fragmented it all into this. We could easily say that. But the photographer doesn't see it that way, and that's why we like photography, because something else comes through. And that's the sense of wholeness that comes through. I have a picture at home which is done by that famous French photographer, I can't remember his name now. And it's just two girls on the street in Moscow and two soldiers coming towards them in the 1950s. And boy, what comes through that picture is just extraordinary. That's the genius of the photographer. And this is very much an example of the kind of thing I was trying to talk about with the whole and the part in that particular way. And she goes on, and she does use Heidegger then from this, and she says, well, I'll read this bit. She goes on to say how this resonance of the whole sense of place within the unique perspective of each individual photograph reminds her of Heidegger's notion of an ontic event. That's really, it means an event. The photographs she took were not just images of objects taken through the camera lens.
They could be seen as no more than objective images, but in her experience they were more than this, inasmuch as each revealed a sense of the neighbourhood as a whole. In Heidegger's language, each image is no longer just a representation of an object, but instead becomes an ontic image through which the being of the place can appear, and so on. So that's really quite interesting. In fact, I realised recently that I don't really. This is really. I only realised recently how much what I'd written in the paper on the whole did reflect this basic thing in Heidegger. But the trouble is, you have to know what he means by being, and I'm not going into that. And he doesn't mean by being what English-speaking people think he means. But anyway, he says that things like these famous things. Which is famous. Being is always the being of beings. I forgot what they are now. I've got it written down. I wrote this down. Oh, do I need to know this? Is it here? I think I wrote this down. No, where is it? I've lost it. Never mind, I'll leave that. What is actually... I won't go back to that because I'm hesitating tremendously here. And I'm feeling awkward because the last time I did this, mentioned this, which I thought was quite a clear example, someone really began to object to it and say that never mind. I can't, something's stopping me from saying this, so I'm not going to say it. I was going to say something else. Now I've lost it now, silly boy. Oh yes, to finish off with. Right. Now, this was a surprise. Looking back now, it seems to me that the difference between the two approaches to wholeness is a reflection of the difference between the two hemispheres of the brain. Now, I just mentioned this earlier on. I got very interested in this work. And the second part of that book, Goethe's Scientific Consciousness, that was originally given as a talk. And I won't go into the detail now, but I got very keen on the idea that the work that had been done on the two halves of the brain very much illuminated Goethe's way of working. Oh, I've now written an article, haven't I? It's in this holistic science thing, so you know about that. Eventually I dropped it, and I was going to put it in that was a monograph, and in that I withdrew back a bit, and I talked about different modes of consciousness, but I actually didn't bring the brain thing in. Now originally I had intended to do that, and that's why it was published where it wasn't around that. Now I drew back because I got fed up of what happened with the brain thing. It went stupid. I probably might have mentioned this in the article, I can't remember, but it reminded me of this business that as a kid. What are little boys made of? Snaps and snails and puppy dog tails. What are little girls made of? Sugar and spice and all things nice. And what happened with the brain research was people decided, well, the holistic thing, oh, well, that was feminine, that was intuitive, that was lovely, and that was what women had. And then there was the other side of things, the analytical side of things. That was the left brain. The other one was the right brain. Oh, and that's what those nasty men were like. They were always doing this analytical thing. And it got very bad, this kind of thing, in the 80s. And in fact, it's so bad, and then all sorts of people took this up. Apparently, an awful lot of people just dropped that kind of thing altogether because they were horrified by what had happened to it. Well, then came what struck me was the publication of McGilchrist's book. Now, I found that by accident. I read a review in the Times of the Supplement that said that McGilchrist is heavily influenced by Heidegger and phenomenology. Oh, I thought. And then I discovered that on the table in front of me for a month, a magazine had been sitting on top with on the front of it an article by McGilchrist, the main advert, and I hadn't even noticed it. So I thought, oh, I don't got this article. So I read this article, and then I thought, will I, won't I read his book? It's a big thing. I did read it, I bought it. I read the first part, which is about 2/3 of it, twice, and the historical part I read once. I'm not so happy about the historical interpretations. I'm really interested in the brain stuff. Now, he actually then did this thing which brought this all back to me, and I thought, now it works. What he said was, we now realise it's not that the functions are divided between the right brain and the left brain. It is that every function is mediated through both brains. So, wholeness is not the prerogative of the right brain. Wholeness is mediated through both brains, halves of the brain. So you get a right brain wholeness and a left brain wholeness. And everything, so the whole and the part, or the one and the many, is mediated through the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And that makes, it's not a question of, wholeness goes through the right hemisphere, the parts go through the left hemisphere, or the one goes to the right hemisphere, the many goes to the left hemisphere. That's bollocks. And that solves my problem. For years my wife has been trying to get me to look at more work on this, and I've said, go away. I'm not touching it. It's snaps and snails and puppy dog's tails, sugar and spice and all things nice. And I'm not having it. Now I can have it. And it goes like this. It seems to me the difference between these two approaches to wholeness is a reflection of the difference between the two hemispheres of the brain. Although the experience of wholeness has always been associated with the right hemisphere, it is now known that every characteristic is in fact mediated through both sides of the brain, and consequently this must also be true in the case of wholeness. According to McGilchrist, quote, the right hemisphere delivers what is new as it presences before the left hemisphere gets to represent it. Representation means representation. The right hemisphere presences and then it is represented through the left hemisphere. It's there in a nutshell. And the whole history of 20th century philosophy is there in that sentence. Whereas the right hemisphere mediates the lived experience of wholeness, the left hemisphere mediates its representation. It replaces experience with a model of experience which then gets confused with and mistaken for the experience itself. The wholeness of the system is in fact the left hemisphere representation of the wholeness which presences through the right hemisphere. This explains why it is that the system's approach seems to be dealing with wholeness, but does so in an artificial way which is a counterfeit of authentic wholeness. Bingo! That's it. That brings me back to the beginning. Lived experience wholeness. This has been a perfect circle. Does that make sense to you?
Yes.
I think what McGilchrist has done is he really has opened a door, and I certainly wouldn't have put my neck on the line by writing about it if I hadn't thought so, because the people involved with Goethe are going to be very, very angry when they see what I've written, because they want Goethe to be spiritual, and so on. Anyway. So that's another story. So that's an afterthought, which really reflects how I now see this whole thing with whole, counterfeit and authentic whole, was somehow or other picking up on this. And it makes sense now at this level as well. What our new problem is, we don't want neurological reductionism. That's our new problem. We don't want to do this in a way which says, oh, it's all produced by the brain. That's wrong. McGilchrist writes very carefully indeed, and he doesn't actually make that mistake. People will pin it on him. You read his prose, he doesn't do it that way. It's subtle. And that text brings me to 1 o'clock. Brilliant. And I didn't have to get into the other today, which was better to do that tomorrow. Wow. We can go. We can go. Okay, folks.
Henry, can you just give us the name
Ingrid Lehman, L-E-M-A-N, I suppose, Stefanovic, S-T-E-F-A-N-O-V-I-C. Now that book should be in the library.
Thank you.
And it's just those three, you'll read what you want, but there are the middle section on foundations of phenomenological thinking based on Heidegger. She talks about originative thinking, and that's what we're doing here. This is going to see what we're doing. This is the problem of the beginning. We begin here, we have to go to the beginning here. That's what I said at the beginning of this talk. I'm actually introducing here what I said at the beginning. Where is the beginning? This is where the beginning is. We begin there. We begin in the wrong place. So all phenomenology is a journey from the end product back into the beginning from which that product came. And that's what it is. And that's what we've been doing. And she calls that originative thinking. A term which I like. Anyway, you can look it up. I'm going for lunch.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, folks.
Thank you. Thank you.